All right, this is text notes for incidents in the life of a slave girl. The excerpts that we read from Harriet Jacobs, and we discussed her life in detail in our lecture notes. And so I chose chapter 1 and chapter 5 as the excerpts because I feel like that kind of gives you a good picture of the of her early childhood and what it was. The whole purpose we talked about in the lecture notes of her text were to try to elicit sympathies from people in the North to the plight of the slave woman, specifically the slave mother, not only being sexually abused, which was commonplace, but also seeing their children get sold, bought and sold, and not being able to really do anything about it. So I thought that these two chapters are pretty good examples of that overall purpose. So we start with her childhood, and she didn't realize that she was a slave, that she was born into slavery, or what that really meant until she was 6 years old. So when she was born, she had a really ideal childhood. Her parents were both light skinned. They were called mulattoes, and which means that there was some white somewhere in their family lineage. And so she kind of lived in a pretty comfortable home. Her mother was a slave, and she was her mistress was a lady named, what is her last name? Why is that? Losing it in, yep, her name. That's her name. There, Horniblow, Margaret Horniblow. I don't know why that left it's such a strange last name. You'd think you'd be able to remember it, but anyway, she was the mistress for Miss. That was her mistress, and she was a kind woman. She was an elderly woman, not like elderly, but in her 40s, and she was a good woman and a good mistress, and not abusive in any of the ways that really mattered. Yes, they were still slaves, but they lived in their own home, and they paid actually Horniblow to live there, and he was able to work at his trade. He was a carpenter, and so they lived, pretty much a normal existence. She didn't know anything any different until she was 6 and her mother passed away, and she realized that she was a slave because she was taken into Horniblow's house, and which even then was not a huge ordeal. She was taken in. Horniblow taught her how to sew. She taught her how to read, and she let her play like a child with her children. And so she really had kind of an idyllic growing up, aside from the fact that she was property, which she didn't even realize until much later. So she talks for a little bit about her maternal grandmother, who was a very remarkable woman. At the time that that she published her text, her grandmother was actually a free woman, but she was her freedom had been given to her from one of her final mistress, I guess. But she talks for a little bit about how her grandmother was such a great employee. She was a great cook. She was known for her cooking all throughout the neighborhood, and the white ladies that lived in the town would often hire her out to make crackers for them, and so she got permission from her master to make these crackers at night after her household work was done, and her whole goal was to try to save up enough money to purchase the freedom of all of her children, which would have included Harriet's mother. So year after year, she lays by this money, baking these crackers, and then when her master died, all of her children were divided among his children. So they were given or willed to other children, and so she was never able to purchase. She's she'd worked all these years to save up the money to purchase their children's freedom, and it never happened, and which was pretty common because they were property. So she loved her grandmother Jacobs, and I'm kind of fast forwarding here into the future, but she loved her grandmother. Her grandmother was would prove instrumental later on, if you remember from the lecture notes, in helping her escape. So then her mother dies, and she lives with Horniblow for a little while until Horniblow dies. And she was kind of like in limbo. She lived with her grandmother for about a week. And then when the Miss Horniblow's will was read, she realized that she had been bequeathed or willed to Horniblow's niece, whose name was Mary, and she was 3 years old at the time. Well, obviously, a 3-year-old can't be the mistress of a slave child. So de facto, she became the property of Mary's parents. And that is kind of where the problems started. So she says, and I found this, I found a couple of quotes in this section really interesting here. She had happy days with, she had happy days with her mistress, but she knew that they would not last forever. But I found this interesting. She says, those God-breathing machines are no more in the sight of their masters, and the cotton they plant or the horses they tend. And so just as a reminder that, hey, they're your property. You're not your own individual. It doesn't matter how faithful you are, how loyal you are, how good of a servant you are. You are property, and so you share that fate of any other good, a cotton or a horse or an animal. So really, when she started living with the Flint family, she was 11 years old. And, well, let me back up just a second. So in her autobiography, Jacobs changed the names of the doctor's children. She changed some ages. I guess for protection, because when she started kind of writing, she was not free. She became free in the process, but as a protection, because the Fugitive Slave Act was still very much in effect. And remember that a runaway slave could be captured and brought back to live. So she kind of changed names to kind of protect. She changed her own name in the story to kind of protect her own identity. So she refers to Dr. Norcom as Dr. Flint in her, and so I'm just going to kind of switch to Dr. Flint now. So she was 11 when she went to live with that family, and at 11 years, from 11 to 14, he pretty much left her alone. But then that all changed. She says, my master began to whisper foul words in my ear. Young as I was, I could not remain ignorant of their import. And so he begins making sexual advances on her at the age of 15, trying to corrupt those pure principles that her grandmother had instilled in her. She says, he peopled my young mind with unclean images, such as only a vile monster could think of. I turned from him with disgust and hatred, but he was my master. I was compelled to live under the same roof with him, where I saw a man 40 years my senior daily violating the most sacred commandments of nature. He told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things. And so this goes on for many years. She's sexually abused, which was common. It was a common fate, and the prettier the slave was, the more dangerous it was for them. And she even kind of aligns that to, white women who are beautiful, they marry well. Black women, if they're pretty, they're more of a target for rape and for sexual abuse. So she understands this danger. She calls him a monster. She understands what's happening even at her young age. And this is where she starts to have this first crisis of her young life. She says, "My soul revolted against the mean tyranny, but where could I turn for protection? No matter whether the slave girl be black as ebony or as fair as her mistress, in either case, there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or from even death. All these are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men." And so, in addition to that, the Norcom's wife, or Flint's wife in the story, Flint's wife, which was her mistress, who ought to be protecting her from this, and stopping her husband from making sexual advances against her. She treated her with jealousy and with rage. And so she's being sexually abused by the master of the house. She is being abused by the mistress of the house, who is jealous of her relationship with her husband, which is all kinds of crazy, because this is obviously, it's not her fault. She had no other choice. And so we see where she starts addressing the women in the North, which we talked about in our lecture notes, being the whole, the primary purpose of this text is to elicit sympathies from the free states, from the northern states, of the plight of the slave woman. She says, "The degradation, the wrongs, the vices that grow out of slavery are more than I can describe. They are greater than you would willingly believe. Surely, if you credited one half of the truths that you are told concerning the helpless millions suffering in this cruel bondage, you at the North would not help to tighten the yoke." And so she goes on to talk about how she really struggled with this, what's happening, why the white man feels he has a right to impose this tyranny upon her, why the white women would turn a blind eye or react in jealous ways and angry and that kind of thing. And so she says that my master met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing by heaven and earth that he would compel me to submit to him. And so she starts to live in fear and in a shame, and she's terrified, and she's brutalized, she's humiliated, and she finds herself no longer a child. She found that she had no one she could confide in, mainly because Flint threatened that he would kill her if she wasn't as silent as the grave. And she couldn't even confide in her grandmother, because she was so ashamed of the situation that she was in, that even if she could have talked to her without fear of death, that she would not have done so, because she was so humiliated and so ashamed of the things that she had been forced to do. So again, here she addresses the women viewers, or readers, I'm sorry, the Northern women readers. She says, "Reader, it is not to awaken sympathy for myself that I am telling you truthfully what I suffered in slavery. I do it to kindle a flame of compassion in your hearts for my sisters who are still in bondage, suffering as I once suffered." So my purpose is I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I want you to step up. I want you to say something. I want you to do something, so that all these other women, her sisters in bondage, might not have to suffer the way that she is suffering. And she alludes here in the very end of this chapter to, she once saw two children playing together, one black and one white. One was beautiful, fair. Her sister, the slave, was also fair and beautiful, not fair, but beautiful. And when they're children, and how they embrace each other, and they don't see color, and they're playmates, and they laugh and have a good time together. She knew that one day that child would deviate down a different path. The fair child, the white child, would grow up to be an even fairer woman, with flowers and sunny skies and a marriage, a happy bridal morning. But she says, how had those years dealt with her slave sister, the little playmate of her childhood? She also was very beautiful, but the flowers and sunshine of love were not for her. She drank the cup of sin and shame and misery, whereof her persecuted race are compelled to drink. And she says, Then why are you silent, ye free men and women of the North? Why do your tongues falter in the maintenance of right? She says, I wish I had more ability. She says, my heart's so full, my pen is so weak, I can't articulate what is happening strongly enough to urge you to move. But this is her challenge, help me, help us, help this situation fight for us, give them the strength and courage to get out and bring an end to this tyranny.